So welcome to my, I suppose, chat really is probably the best way to describe it, on expertise, student-centered learning and the three circles of presence. So as I said, hopefully lots of chance for you to comment and ask questions today, but if you have anything you want to ask later on, do feel free to email me at a later stage. If you're into Twitter, feel free to tweet as well. This presentation and other ones that I've done and other resources are also available on my personal website, so do feel free to take a look at that. What I want to talk about today really is a bit of a train of thought that I've had, and so this is a really nice opportunity for a bit of an informal conversation with some people to see, is this something worth pursuing? Are there ideas here that we can do something with? Is it meaningful? And I'd really welcome your kind of feedback on it. So hopefully it won't be too rambling a train of thought. I've tried to make a clear thread through it and sharing some ideas. But really this is just about kind of bouncing ideas off you regarding what I've been thinking about, I guess. So my starting point is my research area, which is in characteristics of expertise for teaching in higher education. And I've developed this model for expertise. I'm not going to go into this in much detail. There is more information on my website if you're interested in that. But I just, as a starting point for my train of thought, I'll just briefly describe it. So my model's been developed by looking at the extensive literature on expertise in a whole range of professions, things like neuroscience of expertise. I mean, there's a huge amount of work been done in that field. And I've taken the sort of generic characteristics of expertise and mapped them on to our ways of thinking and practicing as teachers in higher education. I've drawn from a number of conversations I've had at workshops and conferences, and also some research that I've done with National Teaching Fellows, and come up with this model that's not definitive. It's really just a starting point for conversation. So I've suggested that there are kind of three elements, three dimensions to expertise. The first one being pedagogical content knowledge. So the knowledge and skills that you need that integrate subject knowledge and knowledge of pedagogy. Next one is around intentional learning and development. So there's the development of expertise, but also the maintenance of it. And it's very much a sort of a dynamic and a proactive development throughout one's career. The particular thing I want to be looking at today, though, is this idea of artistry of teaching, which is the part that we tend not to look at quite so much, certainly in things like sort of PG certs or professional development programs. And it's much more about the sort of the human elements of the interactions that we have with our students, and things relating to performance and improvisation, intuition, and so on. And, sorry, there we go, couldn't find my mouse. So this is my starting point for my train of thought. And I read a really interesting book by Professor Roger Kneebone, who was initially a surgeon, then a GP, and he now works at Imperial College or LSE? I can't remember, that's terrible. Anyway, do Google him. And he's written a fantastic book called Expert: Understanding the Path to Mastery. Now, he acknowledges in his introduction that there are perhaps specific terms there that might not sit comfortably with everybody, but the general approach to the book is really fascinating. And he explores characteristics of expertise that are out there in the literature, but in relation to his own practice as a surgeon, and to other people that he's talked with about their expertise, including taxidermists and tailors. And it's a really interesting and very readable book. And it was really interesting to hear someone else's perspective on expertise. But what really grabbed me here and got this train of thought going was something that he talked about in relation to his own practice as a GP. And he noticed that as he got more experience with that, that he developed a kind of shift of focus. So he described a particular interaction with a patient where they had described symptoms and so on, and he was ready to kind of jump in with my diagnosis as the GP. You know, I have all the knowledge, I'm going to tell you all about it. And then he suddenly thought, actually, I need to know more about them. I need to listen more to my patient. And so he asked other questions, and they sort of started to talk about other things that were going on, which gave a much deeper richness to the conversation, enabled them to then together to move forward with diagnosis and so on. So as I was reading his description of this shift of focus from me to them, that brought me in mind of student-centered learning. I thought, yeah, this is something that we talk about in terms of student-centered learning. And I think there's two aspects to this. So first of all, student-centered learning is a concept that for some people they need to learn. It isn't a natural way of teaching, and it's something that many of us offer in our PG certs and in professional development is understanding this. And for some people, they're able to make the shift from teacher-centered to student-centered as they learn about the concept and are able to think about what it means for them. In Roger's description of it, there's also a sense that for some people it can also be a natural progression as they become more experienced in teaching. They feel more able and comfortable to start working with their students rather than taking that teacher-centered approach. Of course, this doesn't necessarily happen to everybody, but it's something that some experienced teachers do recognise. And this made me start thinking then was, well, what stops people taking a student-centered learning approach? And I started thinking about the role of confidence and why you might take a teacher-centered approach. And there could be because you have too much confidence in your own knowledge and you feel, I should be imparting this to my students, I should be telling them what the answers are. They don't have anything to offer because I'm the person that holds the knowledge. But conversely, you might take a teacher-centered approach because you have too little confidence. Perhaps you're quite shy, you're worried that your students might ask difficult questions. So you'll be, you might feel more comfortable in a more didactic approach to teaching. And then my final kind of thread in this train of thought, so I'm mixing my metaphors there, the final station I stopped at in my train of thought was this idea of confidence and performance. And it reminded me of the 3 circles of presence that Patsy Rodenberg has, an idea that Patsy Rodenberg has developed. I haven't put a link to a reference here, but if you Google either 3 circles of presence or Patsy Rodenberg, there's lots of really interesting resources. There's a TED talk that she provides, and she's also got a number of books where she talks about this. So if you're interested in this further, do have a look. But I'm just going to briefly describe it in relation to teaching in higher education. So my little illustration here is we have our lecturer and the dots represent their students. This is purely for illustrative purposes. Of course, you might not be in that configuration. You might have you might be amongst your students, you might be in front of your students, and so on. This is purely just to illustrate the notion of the 3 circles. So the first circle of presence is very close to you. And the circles are all about energy exchange between yourself and your audience or your students. And in this first circle, you're actually keeping your energy quite close and between you and your students. So you're sort of not reaching out to your students. You might have your notes quite low down and you're kind of reading notes, not making eye contact, in case someone asks an awkward question. In a classroom, you might be kind of hiding behind the lectern to put almost a physical barrier between yourselves, or you might be standing with your back to the students and looking up at your PowerPoint. But it's quite an introverted place to be. In contrast, and part of the reason you might be in that space is because of too little confidence. By contrast, the third circle is sort of out and beyond your students or your audience. And imagine if you're in a lecture theatre, you might be kind of projecting out to the back of the room perhaps because you're overly confident, but even if you're underconfident, because again, it's a way of actually you're not connecting with your students, you're teaching out and beyond them, or speaking out and beyond them. Now, within teaching, there may be scenarios where these approaches actually do work. So, for example, if you're looking at a microscope slide or some sort of artifact under a visualizer, you might be looking in on it, but you'll be drawing in your students' attention and energy because of your interest in this object. Similarly, you might use the third circle if you're out in the field and you're pointing at sort of a distant outcrop of rocks or something, and you want to take your students' attention beyond the space. But actually, even with both those examples, and you do need an element of the second circle, which is where you have that energy sharing with your students. And the second circle is where you really want to be in terms of student engagement. If you've ever been to the theatre or a concert where you felt that the people on stage are performing just for you, even though there might be thousands of people around you, that's the concept of second circle. It's not about physical distance or physical location or space. It's about the sharing of energy and the sense that you're part of something else. So, and obviously it's sort of recognise it's characterised by having more eye contact. Perhaps, I know I do this a lot, using hand gestures to kind of bring people in. And of course, for teaching, it would also be physically moving within the space potentially, or even if it was online, having that literal engagement with students. So just to kind of finish off my train of thought, I just want to quickly say where I first heard about the three circles of presence. And this was from a colleague, Hattie Velker, who is a voice coach. And she doesn't coach singing in the sense of the actual singing itself, but more from a life coach perspective, and how to be thinking when you're performing. And she came to UE and did a fantastic workshop for us on the joys of being a fearless lecturer, which is where she introduced the ideas of the three circles of presence. So just a resource I'd like to share with you, and I'll put the link in the chat box in a moment. We put together a video together around performing for an invisible audience, and this is directed at teachers, lecturers, as well as musicians, and particularly sort of in this time of COVID and having to do pretty much everything online. How do you have that engagement and that second circle when you're working online and you're interacting through your little dot of a webcam at the top of your screen?